Welcome back, everyone, to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. We just talked all about the FAFSA simplification. So if you missed it, go back, listen to that. I don't know how you could have missed it, but hey, who knows? Some people just decide to randomly enter podcasts at any time and place. But we are now going to be speaking directly to seniors who are in the thick of completing applications. Although if you're the parent of a younger student, or if you are a younger student, you should certainly listen in, and you certainly can listen in. We're going to be talking about the activities section, a really important part of most applications. Not all, but most. And joining me for that is my colleague, Brittany Preston, who's also a former admissions officer at UC Boulder, at Oregon State, and at Gonzaga. Hi, Brittany.
Hi, so excited to be here, Beth.
Absolutely. I think this might be the first time you're a guest with me as the host. Is that true?
There was one other time we talked about transcripts, but
Okay,
happy
that's
to be
right.
back.
That's right. Okay, good. Well, I'm glad to have you back. All right, so let's start with the very basics. General introduction to the activities list.
Yeah. Well, first off, I'm really excited we're talking about this today because, like you said, seniors are in the thick of it. And I feel like this is a section they often rush through and don't give a lot of attention to. And they underestimate the importance of this section. So, like you said, a lot of applications have an area called the activity list or the activity section. And this is where a student can highlight what they do outside of the classroom. So the first things that come to mind for them might be their clubs, sports, music, theater, things that they do at their school, but it's so much more than that. It's everything from internships to research to even things like hobbies and family responsibilities. The admission counselors are really curious and interested in what they're doing with their time outside of school. How are they exploring their interests? What skills are they developing? What are they excited about? And this activity list allows them to tell that piece of the story.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you in terms of this is one of the places where when I was an admissions officer, I would see students just fall down on the job. Like,
Mhm.
you've done all of these exciting, interesting things. And now it comes time to translate that into your application, and you didn't do a good job of that. And now I don't have a good sense of what you were doing, why you did it, that kind of thing. All right, so let's talk about that piece. How do they take this group of things that they have been involved in and get it into the application, especially considering that it's certainly in the Common App, the space in which to include that stuff is pretty minimal, really.
Yeah. Yeah, so focusing on the Common App specifically, they give 10 spaces and they ask a variety of specific questions. And like you said, they're extremely limiting in word count and character count. So they're going to ask what the name of the activity is. They're going to ask what the title or what your role was. So this is where you could say if you were a member or a president or a treasurer. I often see students just add really weird things here. It should just be your title.
Yeah.
It's nothing fancy. It's nothing that you should be like cramming something in or putting a full sentence. It's just what was your role? Then it's going to ask how many days per week, how many weeks per year, and what years in high school you participated. So college applications actually don't have a space for you to list what you did in middle school. They're going to be really focused on ninth, 10th, and 11th and 12th grade. So what years did you participate in that activity? The Common App also will ask if this was during the school year, if it was during a break, or if it was a year-long activity. So that's how you can differentiate what you did during the summer versus what you did during the school year.
Right.
But the section where students really struggle is the description. They only give you 150 characters. And it really depends, what your activity is, but that is not a lot of space. And you realize that as you begin to type out and write out what you want to say. So I encourage students to think about, what do you want to highlight? Like, what are the most important things that an admission counselor should know about my involvement in this activity? Whether it be research, whether it be a sport, whether it be a hobby. And think about active verbs. Don't think about just saying exactly what you did, but words like lead or coordinated or challenged, much like a resume, you want to think about the verbs you use to highlight your skills and the role you played in that.
Right. And I think two things stand out for me. One, you mentioned this when you were saying you see students doing weird things with the title and it really should just be your title. You said they're writing a sentence sometimes. No sentences really should be, no complete sentences anywhere in the activity section. This is not a place where you need a noun, a verb, and a
Yeah,
period, right? Like
exactly.
this needs to be short and sweet. And it needs to focus on your role. So another mistake that I would see students make is they were part of some club that maybe at a glance, I wouldn't know what the club was.
Mhm.
So, and the entire description was telling me what the club was. So I don't really, the club matters less than what you did as part of the club. And if you do a good job describing your role, I should generally get a sense of what the club was at that
Yeah.
point, right?
Absolutely. And that's a great point that, like, just like in your college essay, you're keeping the focus on you and who you are. In these descriptions, you should keep the focus on you, what your role was.
Right.
And also don't assume that someone knows what your role was. Like a lot of times I'll see students just, like you said, describe the club, but what was your role as president of that club? Or maybe you're a member of French club. A lot of high schools have French club, but what exactly did your French club do?
Right.
Were you hosting cultural events? Were you bringing in speakers? What was your role in that? And so the more detail you can provide, the better. And like Beth said, don't be afraid to make condensed statements. They're not full length sentences. You can use abbreviations, instead of the word and, maybe you use ampersand. You just saved some word count and some character count.
Absolutely. And I think one other thing that sometimes students will struggle with is how do they come up with the hours per week and the weeks per year? Do you have some guidelines that you suggest for students? For example, if they did something for the whole school year, how long is the whole school year typically? I have what I do. I'm curious more about you.
I'm glad you brought this up because every student I work with or speak to is like, how do I calculate the time? The main reason students struggle with this is most likely it's not a consistent amount of
Right.
time every week of the year. So, if you're a choir student, you might have different times of the year where you're really engaged in performing and you have rehearsals, you have live performances. So, those weeks might be more hours than a week where you just have regular rehearsals or regular class. So, my recommendation is kind of think about the span of time and look at those busy times versus regular times and average it out.
Yeah.
Try your very best to average it out. And a lot of students get worried, well, it's not perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. It can be an estimate, an average. Obviously, look at your list, and if you're over 24 hours a day doing something, an admission
Yes.
counselor might kind of raise an eyebrow. But as a mission counselor, I very rarely went and added everything up. I was more just getting a sense of what was the time commitment, how much time did this take, and what was asked of you. So,
Yeah, the only time I would add it up is if it would looked excessive. So if the
yes,
student kind of overestimated,
yeah,
maybe it was an activity that they actually did for half the school year, but for whatever reason they put for the whole school year. And then I was thinking, how could they possibly have done this for 18 hours a week? And then also had this activity for 10 hours a week.
yeah,
I don't, it just, if something felt off, that's when I might dig a little deeper or say, I think this student is overestimating. But like you, I never sat there and intentionally added everything up. I was really looking for those pieces, as you
yeah,
mentioned. The other thing sometimes I might have a student do, if there isn't a lot to say in the description, I actually had this, my son do this. He had a part-time job. Depending on the time of the year, he worked as many as 23 hours a week at that job. But when it was football season, he worked only about 10 hours a week in that job. So I had him write in the section that just, during this time period, he was doing 23 hours. And at this time period, it was really only 10 because the average didn't tell the whole story.
yeah.
But if he hadn't had space, I wouldn't have had him do it and I wouldn't have worried about it really.
Yeah.
truthfully.
Well, and actually, that's a good point that you just brought up about space because some students worry they don't have enough,
Hmm.
and so they can't fill all 10. For those students, be authentic and make sure you're thinking about things outside of the school day, like hobbies or how you do spend your time. I've seen a student list gaming because they spend a lot of time gaming and competing against other students. But the flip side of that coin, there's students that have more than 10. And
Hmm.
that's where it gets a little tricky. There are things you can combine. So, for example, if you have lots of volunteer service and they're very similar and they were, a couple hours here, a couple hours there at different organizations, that could be something that's similar and could be combined into one row
Yep.
or one activity. But you want to be thoughtful and you may have to cut some things out. And I think for the really high achieving go getter students that have a huge list of activities, that's really challenging for them. So think about, are there ways that maybe that will come up in an essay or other pieces of the application, but put your most important things in those 10.
Right. And there is an opportunity where you might be able to put something in the additional information section. I saw a student the other day who had won a lot of awards in his particular form of art. And so he'd created a little, very short list of those awards. It didn't really fit into the activity section. So he listed it in the additional information section. The admissions officers may or may not look at it, but it's there if they're going to spend some time taking a look. And he didn't have to shortchange his activities to fit those in there. And I think, that was kind of a really important piece. What about how do you think about the order you put them in there, right? So if you're someone who's done a ton of things, or maybe you haven't, maybe you've done 8 really important things, but you do have 10 things that you're putting on the list. How do you think about the order?
Yeah.
This is another big one for
Yeah.
me.
A big message here is those first few slots are the most important. That is kind of the first impression an admission counselor gets. And, good admission counselors are going to really be detailed and read all the way down the list. But ones who are rushing or kind of just getting a snapshot, they might just kind of skim those first few and then skim the rest of the list. So, really being thoughtful about what is most important to me, what is my largest time commitment, and maybe some of the most recent, really big things in your life. So maybe it's not a huge time commitment, but it was a big award that should be further up on the list, or something that you spend the majority of your time doing that should probably be in slot number 1 or number 2.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I like to see students who have leadership. You want to get that up front. Leadership can be really valuable, right? And within that frameworks of most to least important, you also want to be after most important is most to least important. That's number 1. Number 2
Yeah,
is then within that framework, most to least recent. Because you shouldn't be leading with something that you haven't done since 9th grade, right? So
exactly.
that's really important. And then if you can group like items together, I think that can be impactful, but it doesn't always make sense, but it can be a good way to think about it too. So if you are heavily involved in music and you have a number of different music related activities, it might make sense to get them all in order versus having other things interspersed amongst them that are maybe not as integral to the way that you spend your time.
Yeah. Well, and I always ask students the question, if you walked into the admissions office at Penn or CU Boulder and you could only talk about one activity, what is that? Okay,
Yeah.
now you can only talk about two. What is that? And that kind of helps them begin to think about, what do I want them to know? It also begins to paint a picture. So, if you list a bunch of sports up top, I'm going to kind of think, okay, this student spends a lot of time in athletics. If I see a sport and music and student council, all of a sudden I'm seeing a well-rounded student. And so you also want to think about what they're walking away with. If you're applying to a competitive program like computer science, maybe getting one of those experiences in tech or computer science space up in those top 4 can make a difference as well, because you want to demonstrate your interest in the field and what you've done in that field. But at the end of the day, they're just trying to get to know you through these. Like, it's amazing how different stories are told through how you spend your time. And they're trying to pick up on things like leadership, trying to think about time commitments, responsibilities, passions. What are you curious about? They
Right.
use the activity list to determine that and learn your story.
Absolutely. We have just a minute left, but the UC's, the University of California application, also has an activity section. It's a little bit different from the Common App. Any specific tips that you would offer to students filling that application out?
Yeah, so the UCs do give you more space. So a lot of students really find joy that they have 350 characters to describe what they did. And for things like jobs and internships, they also give you additional space to describe that organization. So to your point of student wasting space explaining what the organization is, you don't have to do that on the UCs. So on the UCs, use that space. Don't copy and paste your Common App activity list into the University of California app. Be thoughtful about more detail and beefing those descriptions up. And then other application platforms don't have an activity list. So be aware of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Great advice. Brittany, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts on this.
My pleasure. Have a great day.
All right, thanks. We're going to take another quick break. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about supplemental essays, another really important component of applications and when colleges are asking for those. So don't go away.